Good afternoon. Today is St. Patrick's Day. I saw a program recently on television of Agatha Christie's Hercule Poirot, her Belgian sleuth, who was saying to a suspect, "Where were you on the 17th of March?" And the suspect said, "I don't remember." He said, "Everyone remembers where they are on St. Patrick's Day." So today is that day, and we're going to explore some hymns that come from that tradition. The piece that I just played is a song called, an organ composition called Tune, written by a British composer, C.S. Lang. He's not Irish, but he's close. He's English. And it's a kind of Irish jig, the dance of a jig. So I thought that was appropriate for today. The first hymn that I'm going to talk about today is one that is not sung very often, but it has distinct Irish roots. The hymn in the Episcopal hymn book is number 428. And it's called, "O all ye works of God, now come to thank him and adore. O angels, sing and bless the Lord and praise him evermore." It sounds almost like a New Testament version of a song. So I'm going to play this hymn without further ado, just so that you can hear. It has a lovely melody, and it's based on an Irish folk song. Not much is really known about the tune itself, except that it comes from the 18th century, is the first time it appears in a printed form, and it's in a collection of songs and sacred poems, but it does come from the Irish folk tradition. Here is the tune. It's a very singable melody, and coming from the folk tradition, it's one that's very accessible for people, and many of these hymns, when they first appeared, didn't have music written for them, tunes. So they adapted popular tunes, familiar tunes, folk tunes, and this is one of those. Next, I'd like to move to a hymn that also has very Irish identification. And it's a hymn tune that's called Slain. This is also from a folk melody in Ireland. And in the English hymn books of the time, where they printed music, quite often they would take the name of an area where the tune was composed and use that for the tune name. In this case, the tune name, Slain, refers to a geographic place in Ireland. And it is called the Hill of Slane, or Slane Hill, and in some of the local language, it's called the Bali Schlein. I think you'll see a picture of this coming up. It's near another hill called Tara in England. And if you remember reading or seeing the movie of Gone with the Wind, you'll recall that the plantation was named Tara. Well, in England, Tara was a very ancient area. The whole area of Ireland is just filled with all kinds of amazing history and very, very old history at that, going way back. This particular hill, which is Slane Hill, is 158 meters higher than the surrounding area. That equates to about 518 feet. And the tradition is that there was one of the ancient warlords was buried in this area, and he was known as the Fir. He had a complicated section. F-I-R, the second part of his name is a complicated name that I won't try to pronounce, who is buried on this spot. And that's going back to early days, be somewhere in the early 200s or 300s, I believe. And there is a mound on the hill that is not part of the hill where they think possibly had been a burial site. Well, in the 5th century, Patrick, who was born in England and who went to Ireland as a missionary, he was associated with the Christian church. He was later known as St. Patrick, and he went there as a missionary. One of the first places that he visited was this area called Slane, or Slane Hill, S-L-A-N-E, Slane. And at the time that he was there, in the 5th century, somewhere around 433 AD, he decided to take a noticeable Christian posture by lighting the first fires of Easter, the Paschal fires, on the hill of Slane. There is some dispute as to whether it was that hill or another hill by some of the scholars and the people who work on geography of the area, but be that as it may, he did light such a fire, and he lit it in anticipation of the Paschal celebration. There was a king in the area, the High King of Ireland, who was a pagan king, who had declared that no fires could be lit prior to the fire that he would light on the mountain, the hill of Tara. And this hill could be seen far and far in the area. It was about 16 miles away from the hill Slane. And tradition has it that it was at Slane that St. Patrick decided to anticipate this and to go ahead and light the fires of Easter to make a Christian declaration of faith, which he did. That part is history. As to which hill it was, that part is up for some discussion. But he did that, and the king was so either impressed or angry about this whole thing that he just stood back. He was amazed at the bravery and the stance that Patrick took, and he then permitted him to go amongst the people of the area and to do missionary work to convert people to Christianity. It was the first experience of Christianity in Ireland. So we have two tunes, or rather we have two texts, separate texts that are attached to this tune. The tune itself is an old tune from Ireland, and it was again a folk song that was known as The Banks of the Bann. And it was a Northern Irish folk song, and it was first published in a collection in 1909. But its tradition goes back many, many years before that. In our Episcopal hymn book, we have two hymns that are associated with this particular tune. The first one that you're going to see is hymn 482, and it's entitled, Lord of All Hopefulness. The text is fairly contemporary. It was written by an English writer, Jan Struther, or John Struther, Jan, and she wrote this in the early 1900s. It's a hymn that's used for weddings, for funerals, for liturgical occasions, and it was used by Prince Harry and Meghan at their wedding. It's one of the most popular hymns in the UK. I'm going to play the tune for you so that you can hear, and I'm going to play 2 verses of the hymn, Lord of All Hopefulness. So these are the words of the first setting, Lord of All Hopefulness, which is hymn 482. This particular ends, the last phrase on each of the 4 verses has to do with the time of the day. First is at the break of the day, the second verse is at the noon of the day, the third day is at eve of the day, and then the fourth is at the end of the day. The other hymn that we have of the same text, of the same tune, is from a much, much older text, a text that goes back probably to the 500s or 600s AD. And it comes to us in this contemporary language of Be Thou My Vision, a very popular tune. And again, it's one that has a beautiful lyrical quality about it. And it's one that everyone, I think, can sing easily. And the fact that it comes from a tradition that is a folk tradition means that it's going to be singable and easy to sing. So I'm going to play 3 verses of Be Thou My Vision, during which you will, I think, see some scenes of Ireland.
Sure.
This will sound familiar. Now, another hymn that's made a great impact on worship in the Anglican Church and in many denominations now, but especially in the Episcopal congregation and the Anglican Church, is from an ancient text that is attributed to St. Patrick. And the tune itself is called St. Patrick's Breastplate. I think we have a couple of pictures of St. Patrick. There are many sculptures and statues of him, and there are also stained glass visions of him as well, including one that's in St. Mary's Church in the narthex. But first you're going to see a form of the hymn itself. It's a very lengthy hymn, as we know, and there are more verses than are even printed in the Episcopal hymnal, and it takes up 4 pages of our hymn book. But it was originally written in the calligraphy and in the Gaelic language, which is, of course, difficult to know unless you're a scholar studying that. But you can see in this particular picture a manuscript which is at Trinity College in Dublin in Ireland. And this is the first, perhaps one of the oldest forms of the hymn itself. It has gone through translations. It had to be translated, obviously, and from the Gaelic language into into English later. But Patrick, who was from England originally, went to Ireland, and he had to learn the language, the Celtic language. And it was something that was a necessity for him, and it became a language that is very difficult for us to know and read today. Now you can see a picture of the stained glass window. When you come in the front door of St. Mary's Church into the narthex, if you take an immediate sharp right, rather than go into the church, into the nave of the church, immediately on your right, you will see a window of St. Patrick. And in the window, you can see a lot of green in his vestments, and of course, beautiful blues and reds. Above his head, you might be able to see that there is a harp, which refers perhaps to King David from the Old Testament, and it obviously also refers to the tradition of the Celtic music and using a harp for accompaniment. Around his feet and around the staff, the crozier which he's holding, which is a sign of being a bishop, there is a serpent. And there is a tradition that when he came from England to Ireland, that the land was infested with poisonous snakes, and that he drove them out. You will also see in the details of the window some shamrocks here and there, and it's worth visiting when you come to St. Mary's and see this very beautiful window. It's especially nice when the sun is coming right through it in the late afternoon, because it faces west and it gets great exposure there. St. Patrick wrote a prayer at one point, and he wrote it as a kind of defense against the dark forces of evil, and as a prayer of deliverance to God, but it was also a prayer that was acknowledging God's omnipotence and acknowledged that God was the creator and was also present in our lives through Jesus as our Redeemer and Savior. So it's a hymn that combines a lot of different elements, and it was first known as a prayer, and it was called the Lorica of St. Patrick. And that Lorica became translated as the breastplate. And it was a prayer that evidently he kept close to him. And there is a story that it was, on one occasion, he was being chased by one of the pagan kings and many of his followers, and they were trying to destroy them and he and his followers were hiding in a forest, and they were praying this prayer, which is essentially the words of the hymn that we're going to examine. And the tradition has it that the the forces who were trying to destroy him, were chasing him, were confounded visually, and all they could see instead of people was a flock of deer. There's another tradition which says that St. Patrick and his followers were rendered invisible, and these loricas, or prayers, were then thought of people as a way to be rendered invisible for their safety when they need it. Regardless of what that tradition produces for us, the hymn itself is a magnificent work of literary work and theological statement. It was finally they tried different tunes with it, but it's a difficult hymn because it is very long, and it has the meter of it poetically is pretty symmetrical, but it's called a long meter doubled, and it has many phrases that go on and on and on, and the different verses are not all of the same length. Verse 1 has a particular length, and it takes up one verse of one page of our hymnal. Then verses 2, 3, 4, and 5 are taking 2 pages of the hymnal. Verse 6 is very different. It goes from a meter that the iambic pentameter has preceded this. The first part of it is in this meter, which is from weak to strong beats, ta-da, ta-da, ta-da. And then it shifts, and it goes to the opposite in the next section, in verse 6, where it talks about Christ within me. And it goes from strong beats, immediate strong beats, to weak, strong to weak, instead of weak to strong. Then, on verse 7, the final verse in our hymnal, it goes back to the same meter and length as we had for verses 2, 3, 4, and 5. This sounds like maybe a lot of a roadmap gone bad, unless you have a hymn book in front of you and you can look and examine and count some of these things. But the other interesting thing about it is that because of the poetry, you'll see it there in front of you. On verse 6, the text changes, and the feeling of the thing is so different that a different tune is used for it. And in verse 6, there's a tune that's known by the name Deirdre for verse 6. And it is acknowledged at the bottom of the page. Deirdre, and it's also an Irish melody. So we have 2 melodies here. The first one is a very old Irish melody that's used for verses 1 through 5 and 7. And then this much more introspective text talking about Christ within me for verse 6 uses a different text. And the name Deirdre is associated with it may be folklore, but with a young woman of that name, or a form of that name, that's the English and the later form of the name, who was committed to marrying a king, that she was not very happy about this whole thing, and she was really in love with another person, a young man with whom she really loved, and so she decided not to marry the king, and she went instead with this young man. Well, the king was very angry about it, and there was a war, and he saw to it that the young man was involved in the war, and the young man was killed in the war, but the king was also killed later. And so she regretted the death of both of them, and she sang a lament over the graves. And that lament is essentially the tune that we have for the second tune. So I'm going to play the hymn. I'm going to play verse 1, which is 1 page, and then I'm going to play verse 2 and verse 5. Then we shift to a different tune for the tune Deirdre, for verse 6, and then we come back to verse 7. So I mentioned that this hymn is very encompassing of many topics theologically, and it really divides into 11 sections. And the first is an invocation of the Trinity. And then the hymn goes on to talk about Christ's baptism, resurrection, ascension, and the return of Christ. And it talks about the invocation of the virtues of angels, patriarchs, martyrs, etc., etc. And then we get to this invocation for Christ's protection in verse 6. Christ be with me, Christ be within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me. And then finally, we come to the last version, the last page, which again is a statement, a very strong Trinitarian statement. So it's a hymn that's useful for Trinity Sunday, for other times of the year, and we've used it frequently at St. Mary's for confirmation. It makes the service longer, but it's a grand hymn. So I will play at this time verse 1, then verse 2 and 5, verse 6 and verse 7, a total of 4 or 5 verses. And you might see again some pictures of good St. Patrick and Ireland as we go through this. Verse 2. So it's a very powerful hymn, both in its text and the music agrees with the text in supporting it in a wonderful way. Well, I hope you've enjoyed our hymns today for St. Patrick's Day, that hymns that come from the Irish tradition with the folk tradition being a very strong part of their faith. In closing, I'd like to play a little tune. Since it's St. Patrick's Day, we can't really leave any discussion or any group of people without having a wonderful Irish melody that goes through everyone's mind and ears, I think, at this time. It's a very beautiful one. So I'm going to close with that folk tune, Danny Boy. Well, happy St. Patrick's Day. And I hope you join us next week when we're going to have some very different hymns. And I say different not to say I don't know what they are. I have them planned already. But quite a different set of things here that I think you will find very interesting and pertinent to next week's dates and what's going on next week. So thank you for joining us today.